Hello my friends, my name is Cole, this is Kvoth, welcome back to Boas and Buffoonery. Today, I'm going to teach you how to not kill your pet blood python, and how they can absolutely thrive in captivity. Blood pythons are some of my favorite snakes on the planet, and I think they make some of the most fascinating pet reptiles that we can possibly have the pleasure to keep. Now, in my opinion, the first major key to successfully keeping any pet reptile in captivity and allowing them to truly thrive in your care is to understand their natural history. We need to understand where this animal comes from and how it thrives in the wild. Blood pythons are found in parts of western Malaysia, Thailand, Sumatra, and the surrounding low-altitude island rainforests that make up that area of Southeastern Asia. The climate in these rainforests is typically very warm, very humid, with heavy rainfall, especially during the monsoon seasons. The temperature in this region typically ranges between 75 degrees Fahrenheit and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which roughly translates to about 24 degrees Celsius to 32 degrees Celsius. I've heard some people say that blood pythons kind of prefer cooler temperatures, and this is kind of true relative to other tropical python species or tropical boa species that people are familiar with, but I come from Canada, so my idea of cool is a little bit skewed. Blood pythons, the python brongersmai, along with the other short-tailed pythons, live as true ambush predators. I've often said that blood pythons sort of live like a breathing landmine, sitting perfectly still waiting for food to walk by. I like to think that that's a pretty accurate description of their typical behavior. They will bury themselves in the dense foliage of the jungle or even hide out in shallow, murky water, waiting for primarily rodents to walk by, but also for birds landing to take a drink, as that's what makes up the bulk of a blood python's diet. Most people think of blood pythons as roughly the same size as a ball python, but if you saw a 7-foot, 30-pound ball python, I'd call you a liar. If you told me that you'd seen a 7-foot, 30-pound blood python, I'd say, yeah, that's a big adult female. Most blood pythons are going to stay between 5 and 6 feet long, but they will get incredibly heavy, most reaching over 20 pounds. So now that we understand a little bit more about where blood pythons come from, how do we replicate that environment in captivity? Well, the first thing that you're going to want to do is set up an enclosure to allow this blood python to thrive. Starting with enclosure size, you're going to want an enclosure that will allow your blood python to fully stretch out the entire length of its body. When a blood python is comfortable, that is typically how they'll sit, kind of half buried under some foliage, and they will lay themselves straight out. So it is important that they have the space to do so. For example, Kvoth is currently in a 6-foot by 2-foot by 2-foot enclosure. I also highly recommend that you include a water bowl in the enclosure that is big enough for them to fully submerge themselves in. They don't necessarily swim, but they do seem to enjoy soaking, and like I said, they will sometimes hunt in the water, so it's important that they have that opportunity. The next thing that you're going to want to get right is, of course, the temperature of that enclosure. A temperature gradient is still important, even though oftentimes they will be stretched out across the entire enclosure. I recommend a cool side of roughly 75 degrees, though it can fluctuate, and then a warm side of roughly 90 degrees, which again can fluctuate. But you don't want them to get too warm. These snakes get really stressed out at particularly high temperatures. The next thing that you absolutely have to have dialed in when taking care of a blood python is making sure that you have nailed their humidity. These snakes come from jungles where the humidity is through the roof and they experience torrential rainfall. You are not going to get away with just a small water dish in their enclosure for humidity. A blood python is going to do best in an enclosure that has 75% humidity and up, but that also receives a regular misting. I recommend either an automated misting system or that you yourself go in and spray down the enclosure at least once every other day, depending on your climate. I live in Ontario, so for me, during the winter, I have to mist my enclosures far more often than I do in the summer, where it's already pretty humid. Within that enclosure, I recommend a substrate that holds humidity really well. I use a combination of cocoa fiber, cocoa husk, and sphagnum moss to really hold in that humidity and moisture. This is also beneficial because blood pythons pee a lot more than other snakes do, and having that absorbent substrate that you change regularly can be a massive, massive boon. But along with this massive water bowl and regular misting comes the complication of ventilation. You don't want this enclosure to be sopping wet. You don't want the substrate to be soaked because that can be a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. So you need to have an enclosure that is remarkably well ventilated, especially to reduce the risk of respiratory infections, which is one of the most common killers of blood pythons in captivity. How you heat a blood python's enclosure is largely up to you. However, I pretty much recommend a heat bulb and a UVB light for almost all reptiles. Blood pythons are nocturnal. They're unlikely to spend much time basking, though that's not to say that they never will. They are used to, in the wild, using the sun as their primary heat source. Many people will recommend heat tape or a heat pad, which isn't the worst, but in the wild, these snakes are going to bury themselves under leaf litter and under shallow water to cool themselves off. So if they're sort of going under the leaves to try to get cooler, and that's actually where they're getting warmer, I can see that as a bit of a bad deal. When setting up the rest of your blood python's enclosure, it's going to be crucial to add plenty of hides, both on the warm and the cool side of the enclosure, and I like to fill the space between with some fake foliage or real leaf litter to increase the feeling of security that my animal has while inside his enclosure. I also can't recommend enough a front opening enclosure so that you don't come across as some sort of predator when you go to interact with your pet snake. And that kind of brings me to a key point about blood pythons is temperament. Lots of people online will tell you that blood pythons are mean, they're cantankerous, or they love to bite people. And that's simply not true. Blood pythons do not like to bite people. They're not going to seek out biting you, and they are not aggressive snakes. They are, on average, typically a little bit higher strung than other snakes. They are a little more anxious. So it is important, especially when they're young, to interact with them on their terms. I wouldn't just reach in blindly and drag your blood python out of the enclosure and then have it sit on your lap. That's going to stress it out to no end, and that's where you're most likely to get bit. If you work with your snake and build a relationship with it, blood pythons can really mellow out very, very easily. Voth is actually one of my favorite snakes to handle, and I am just so in love with his remarkably curious personality. But that's not to say that there aren't more considerations to make when interacting with your blood python than there would be with other popular pet species. I would recommend tap training your blood python because they absolutely love food, and I do recommend a slow buildup of handling, especially if you get your blood python as a baby and it takes a little bit of time for them to get used to you. One aspect of blood python care that I see the most people run into some issues with is regarding their feeding. It's not difficult to feed a blood python, don't get me wrong, and their diet is remarkably simple to replicate in captivity. They feed predominantly on rodents in the wild, and the most common and most accessible form of feeders in captivity is also rodents. That's fantastic. The thing you really want to watch out for when feeding your blood python is that you're not feeding them too much. Blood pythons have remarkably slow metabolisms. They are a slow-moving snake that's going to sit perfectly still for the vast majority of their lives. It shouldn't come as a massive surprise that they don't need to eat very often. They do much better with large meals infrequently. Especially as adults, I recommend feeding your blood python no more than once every 3 to 4 weeks. Otherwise, blood pythons can become obese very easily. One sort of odd thing in regards to a blood python that's different to most other snakes is that you really do want to see that defined spinal ridge on your blood python. If you start to lose that and you have kind of a round sausage of a blood python, it's time to tone back the feeding a little bit. And like with most other snakes, don't expect them to hold back for you. They will eat anytime they're presented with food because in the wild, those opportunities for food are exceedingly rare when you're a snake that doesn't really move much. Now, if you do all of these things, you're going to have a great time with your blood python. You're definitely going to keep it alive. But if you know me and you know anything about this channel, you know that that's not where the standard of care for our reptiles stops. Let's talk about enrichment for blood pythons. Sometimes enrichment for blood pythons can be a little bit tricky. These are slow-moving, heavy-bodied snakes. They don't really climb much, so finding ways to enrich their lives and make sure that their mental health is taken care of, you have to get a little bit creative. One of my favorite ways to enrich Foth's life is to give him swim time. I will fill up a bathtub with some warm-ish water and allow him time to swim. Importantly, I think you should probably include some sort of anchor, like a big rock, when allowing your pet snake to go for a swim in the bathtub. But it can be a ton of fun to watch, and it can be very rewarding for your animal. Another form of enrichment that I absolutely recommend for blood pythons is changing up their diet from time to time. We already talked that these snakes predominantly eat rodents, but mixing in some bird feeders occasionally really is an excellent idea. I also recommend that you mix up the type of fake or real foliage in the enclosure so that you give your pet reptile access to a variety of scents and smells and change them up from time to time to keep them thinking. I also think that handling your blood python can be an excellent form of enrichment, especially if you do it on their terms. Blood pythons can be a little bit anxious, but if you put in the time and the effort to make them comfortable around you, comfortable enough to allow their curiosity to absolutely shine around you, it can be an excellent way to get them out of the enclosure and exploring the world around them. That's a lot of information all at once, so let me break down some key points that I think you really need to focus on if you want to bring a pet blood python into your life. I also just want to say that I think that you do. These snakes are incredible. Kvothe's one of my favorite snakes that I've ever worked with. They have such curious personalities, especially if you put in the time and energy to make them comfortable enough around you to let that personality shine. The first key point that I really want to hammer home is that this is a heavy-bodied, slow-moving snake in a highly humid environment. Make sure that your ventilation is 100% on point. The second thing that you really need to remember is that this is typically a high anxiety animal. So when you do handle them, when you do interact with them, do it at their pace. The two major health problems that you can run into with a blood python are respiratory infections from lack of humidity or lack of ventilation, as well as obesity. Feed them sparingly, they're already big boys. Blood pythons, like most other snakes, are most vulnerable as babies. So if you are lucky enough to be bringing a baby home, make sure that you already have your parameters dialed in before that snake goes into the enclosure. I would recommend a captive bred snake regardless of what species that you were planning on working with, but with blood pythons, especially if you want a handleable blood python, I cannot stress enough the importance of getting an animal that is captive bred. Luckily, there are plenty of breeders, regardless of where you live, especially in North America, that are working with blood pythons. If you want to, you can find a captive bred individual, and I highly recommend that you do. The last key point that I really want to hammer home is that this snake is going to get bigger than you think. These are massive snakes. A 5.5 to 6 foot blood python is going to weigh over 20 pounds. These are big snakes. If you get a sizable female blood python, as an adult, you could be looking at a 7 foot, 25 to 30 pound animal. That is a massive snake. You're going to need a much bigger enclosure than you think you will. And you're absolutely going to fall in love with them. These snakes are remarkably fascinating. They're incredibly entertaining to work with. Their personality and their inquisitive nature reminds me a lot of a reticulated python, and they are a hell of a lot easier to take care of than a reticulated python. So if you've been looking for an absolutely adorable pet snake with the brain of a retic that's built like a small bulldozer, and you know that you can lock in an enclosure that provides adequate humidity, adequate ventilation, and you are willing to earn the trust of an anxious noodle, then a blood python might just be the perfect addition to your family. Guys, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate each and every one of you. I hope you have a remarkable rest of your day, an awesome rest of your week, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.